Thank you all for joining us today. I hope everyone is doing well or as well as can be expected given the challenging situation we all find ourselves in with COVID-19. We'll be talking a little bit about that later. So I want to first start with turning it over to my colleague here, Samaya, who is going to be giving us just some of the housekeeping rules around this webinar. Samaya?
Thank you so much, Patty. Yes, so that does bring us to our housekeeping rules. So just letting everyone know, the webinar will run approximately for 60 minutes with time for a question and answer session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please also note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic back to Patty. So Patty, you can go ahead and get started.
Perfect, thank you so much. And just a quick correction that this is a 90-minute webinar, so we have plenty of time, although I have a feeling this is gonna go by really, really quickly. Show my screen here. So this meeting is really in follow-up to an executive roundtable that Avoca held in New York City to discuss provider qualification practices. And my co-host for that meeting was Brian Whitlock. Brian is Vice President and Head of Global R&D at Global Procurement R&D at BMS. So Brian and I are actually going to tag team a bit and cover the key highlights and the takeaways from that roundtable. You know, I'm also joined by my Avoca colleagues, Jay Turpin, John Jordan, and Dennis Salati. And we're going to be engaging all of you in this discussion as well. As Samaya said, we encourage you to include your questions and your comments, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We are happy to be able to present the research results from the Avoca Tufts vendor qualification benchmarking study as part of this meeting. And I see Michael Wilkinson from Tufts has joined this meeting, and I just want to give a shout out to Michael for all the great work he did in leading the working group and working with Jay on that. We'll also give you a sneak peek of the Diligent platform, our solution to address qualification challenges. So just a quick background about the Avoca Group. We are a consulting and research firm that is laser focused on quality and compliance in clinical trial execution. And the work that we have been doing in qualification really started with our quality consortium. Pretty early on in the life cycle of the consortium, the executive leadership from our member companies really raised challenges around qualification as an industry issue that they felt was worthy of really addressing in a collaborative way. And we started by doing research. After that research, we launched a major initiative to create industry standards. We tackled the technical service provider categories first. And by 2015, we actually had a complete body of work of industry standards mapped to regulatory guidance, including tools like RFI tools, visit checklists, scorecards. And at that time, the advisory board that helped us launch this initiative really suggested that we might consider centralizing some of these activities through Avoca, because the standards themselves conferred value in that, you know, every single company were using different tools, different criteria for qualifying their providers. The standards started to sort of bring the industry together, but the advice we got was to really drive efficiency and cost savings and time savings. There's no reason why that, you know, that business process shouldn't be centralized. So, so we've been at this now for a few years. We ran a pilot, which was successful, in that we manage hundreds of RFIs through a single sort of low-tech platform. We conducted multi-sponsor qualification assessments, and then we moved into actually creating the technology platform itself. Now, fast forward to 2020, that platform is up and running, and we're working with clients, and it's client ready. We'll show that later, but we're still continuing with the standards. We those standards continue to get updated as guidance changes, and also we've moved into some of the more emerging tech categories, things like telemedicine, mobile HCP visits, e-regulatory binders, e-informed consent. So we'll later in the meeting, my colleague Dennis will actually talk a little bit more about how those standards were created. These are our AQC member companies. I think a lot of the participants in this call today are actually members, so I really would like to encourage you to, if you don't have the credentials to access the Knowledge Center, please reach out to us. As a member, you have access to this complete body of work with our qualification standards, but you also have access to the hundreds of leading practices, tools, and templates that we've developed over the last many years. We also have an online community, which I have to say is very active right now, with members asking questions of each other given the COVID-19 situation. So I want to bring Brian Whitlock into the discussion here. Thank you again, Brian, for being part of this meeting. So Brian and I are going to talk about just the key takeaways from this executive roundtable that we held. But first, before we get started, Brian, can you just tell us a little bit about your role at BMS?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Patty, and good day, everyone. Before we get started, I personally hope that each of you are safe, healthy, and well, as is the case with those that are close to you. So as Patty had introduced, my name is Brian Whitlock. I lead the Strategic Sourcing and Procurement Organization for R&D at Bristol Myers Squibb. I've been with the organization just over 5 years now, and have been in the biopharma industry, both on the CRO side as well as with other biopharma organizations over the last 20 years. At BMS, how do we define R&D procurement? So my team is accountable for all the strategic sourcing capabilities globally, whether we're talking about research, clinical development, and the associated regulatory services that go with that. But also we define it as all the efforts across the company, not just R&D related to real-world evidence. A responsibility that I've picked up recently, which is actually quite fitting for today's call, is I'm co-sponsoring the development of what we call a next generation third-party risk management program that is still under development, but will be deployed enterprise-wide across the organization. So again, thank you so much, and look forward to sharing with you guys today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yes, so, this meeting that we held in New York City really included a lot of the large, biopharma companies. That was kind of by design. When Brian and I first started talking about this meeting, we discussed that it actually would be interesting to hear what other companies are doing in the area of qualification. We looked at individual approaches, common challenges, solutions, but we also took a kind of a step back too, to sort of get our arms around what is the state of the industry. And I think there was a lot of discussion around just with individual companies, just the resource burden that is prevalent just given, just the lengthy RFI questionnaires, the number of qualification assessments that are being done. When we take a step back and look from an industry-wide perspective, what we have is essentially every sponsor qualifying every vendor. And if you think about that there's 2,000 plus pharma and biotech companies and maybe 4,000 providers, and that's a growing number. With all of those companies, sending out RFIs and visiting for qualification assessments, it becomes very unwieldy, obviously. And I mean, we've shown this slide before at Avoca, and usually the title is Industry Insanity, because it really is, if you think about it, it is kind of chaotic. We have a client who shared that they have to host, now this is a larger CRO, but they're hosting about 300 qualification assessments a year. So it's not only a burden for sponsors, it's also quite a burden for the providers, obviously. And Brian, could you comment on this and just from your perspective, what do you think, what is the situation at VMS, and what are your thoughts about just the sheer resource burden associated with qualification?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think the supplier qualification process at VMS is largely any different from, any of our other partner companies in the industry. We identify the need to, leverage a supplier for whatever good or service. We gather our requirements with our stakeholders. We then set out a scope of services. And then we go through an iterative RFX process, whether it's getting a quote, doing an RFP, doing an RFI, any of those acronyms. And as part of that process, there's a number of supplier meetings, questionnaires, follow-up questionnaires, quite frankly, a very large amount of email exchange. And then, in some cases, there are on-site evaluations and audits that are conducted. And as you had mentioned, Patty, when we had the opportunity to meet in January in New York City, I think that was the consensus amongst those that were participating. And largely speaking, when we do risk assessments or we do evaluations, it's typically around things like quality standards. What are the operational and or technical standards? We'll do basic financial solvency and health checks, which quite frankly, I think everyone on this call, their organizations largely do the same thing. And what we discussed, and I think the real opportunity is, one, to lower the cost of the sponsor and the provider doing business with one another. And coming from a procurement position, just to clarify, when I say cost, I don't mean per se the rates that are in an SOW or in a contract, but it's really the time, the effort, and the resources that go into that. So by lowering that, our teams can move faster, we can serve patients more efficiently, but all the while we do this with the aim of improving operational and quality standards and ultimately outcomes for those that we serve.
Yes, and I think you're right about the fact that there was consensus among the group, and while there was nuance, obviously, in terms of how companies are approaching this. I think there was an acknowledgement that some of these activities that every single company does are repetitive and not necessarily a competitive advantage, obviously. And in addition to the industry inefficiency, we have as a backdrop that we're in a very dynamic environment. So regulations are changing. The ecosystem is evolving in terms of the number and the types of companies that are coming into the marketplace. And I know, there was a fair amount of discussion that just trying to get your arms around like onboarding new capabilities and having the internal subject matter expertise to like just do a good job with that is a challenge. And this slide that's showing now, the challenge is a deeper dive. This was my attempt to take a very long, robust and rich conversation and narrow it down to basically, one slide. But, one of the themes, I think, was the silos, the functional and organizational silos. And I think with large pharma in particular, that's an issue. And I'd be curious for those who are joining that are with smaller companies, if these challenges resonate, or if these aren't issues at all. It would be actually interesting to hear from you, because one of the things we didn't mention is after this meeting, we're actually going to take a look at any questions that are asked and any comments that are posted and create an executive summary for everybody. So please join in if you want to, let us know what's happening with your organization, and also if you have any questions for either me or for Brian. And also in addition to silos, these heightened expectations from regulators. I know from some of our clients, some of the larger companies feel like they may actually be held to somewhat of a higher standard with the regulators. And Brian, you mentioned your new role with risk-based management. I think each person who attended that meeting talked about just their company's approach to risk-based qualification, and it seemed like each company were in like just varying stages of implementing just a kind of a rigorous approach to risk management. So so Brian, I kind of want you to jump in here in terms of just from what's happening now within BMS, and especially the fact that you're going through a merger. What's your perspective on some of these challenges, and which ones are you prioritizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the midst of a massive integration, managing a global pandemic, and then quite frankly, just running the business, there's a lot of priorities. There's also a lot of opportunity. And, within our supplier evaluation and the opportunity to really enhance our third-party risk management practices, what we've learned not only at Heritage BMS, but within Heritage Celgene is silos that exist across the organization are the predominant challenge. When we think about risk management at Bristol Myers Squibb, there are specialty groups, whether it's cybersecurity, physical security, quality, the list goes on, where risk assessments are being done, and they're being done, very thoroughly with great insights. The challenge, like we discussed back in January, is the larger the organization, the more difficult it becomes to share that information across organizational seams. And what we're aiming to do is to take those disparate risk assessments, aggregate them together so that decision makers, whether it's myself or it's other leaders in the organization, can make more informed decisions. When you think about an organization such as the one that I'm part of, even though I don't think it's quite frankly all that different than most, if not every company that's represented on this call, sustainability and scale of a program that takes into consideration multiple risk and evaluation criteria is key. And we're really looking at technology and new technology providers that are entering the market to help us do that efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, and particularly now, just the ability to be able to evaluate and mitigate risk is, more important now than ever, obviously. And I think when we were all sitting around that conference table in January, there was absolutely no way we could have predicted, what would, be our world now with COVID-19 and the clinical trial disruptions. And, one thing that is, heartening is just to see how the industry is coming together. And, we see with our members and with our clients that clinical trial professionals and people who are on the front lines are having to make decisions very, very quickly, and really important decisions around patient safety and data integrity. The industry as a whole is mobilizing too. I mean, Avoca, as part of our consortium, created a rapid response working group, and I was pretty amazed because we had the idea, we put it out to our members. Within a couple of days, we had 70 companies, I think over 120 people who all joined together on a call to really share their experiences and to help each other. And that is continuing. Brian, just can you, you mentioned, COVID-19 as a disruptive force. Can you talk a little bit more about that and just what you're noticing?
Yeah, so COVID-19 is an event that, our industry plans for as truly a worst case scenario. This is an event that doesn't impact just Bristol Myers Squibb or a subset of sponsors and providers. It impacts all of us. It impacts everyone that touches the supply chain. And having had the opportunity to meet with peers, other executive leadership at strategic partners to our organization over the last few weeks, I think this is one of those events that's really going to, if anything, bring the industry together more than ever. And we have within our executive leadership, whether it's our president of research or other LT members, is putting competition aside, quite frankly, and working together as an industry to solve this very serious problem. And that's very encouraging. I think that crises such as this, as stressful and as unfortunate as they are, they do present a great opportunity for all of us to look at quantum evolutions in how we develop therapies, and quite frankly, how we can work together and do that in partnership with regulators, especially looking at technologies in this digital age.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, Brian, because I think that in this time, which is stressful, the idea that there's something that is going to be positive on the other side of that is very optimistic. And I agree with you that in some ways this is catapulting the industry to actually adopt innovation and maybe new ways of doing things more quickly. We wanted to just get our audience involved a little bit, and we have a polling question that I'll ask my colleague Lisa to launch around just the use of new and emerging technology providers. So, we have seen a little bit of sluggishness over the last couple of years in terms of adopting new technology and innovation. The question is, as a result of COVID-19, the statement is, as a result of COVID-19, my company's portfolio of clinical service providers will include more new and emerging tech providers. So if everybody could answer that question by selecting strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, disagree or strongly disagree. And I see the polling coming in. We have about 50% of the people that are on the line who have voted, and now it's quickly increasing. And I'm getting like a little bit of a sneak peek here of the results, and actually, distributed a little bit more evenly than I would have thought. We have now 3/4 of the people. We'll give it, just another few seconds here for final people to weigh in. And Lisa, could you launch the poll, please? Yeah, so we have, about, almost 40% of people agreeing with this statement, and very few disagree. In terms of new technology, we at Avoca in 2018, we conducted some research on just perspectives of technology and innovation. Thank you, Lisa. Our research actually looked at the impact of new technologies on things like reducing costs, mitigating risk, reducing timelines, and just showing a snippet of the data there. The green represents highest impact. And in talking with my colleague Dennis Lottie, who runs our research program, we were discussing that we'd like to actually take a look at this again, just to see, will this data look very different now, given the need to enter into new ways of doing things and using new technologies. I particularly wonder about the data around enhancing the focus on patients and improving how we work with sites, just because of the need for remote monitoring and working kind of in a new environment here. Dennis, I don't know if you want to jump in on any of this or any comments.
Yeah, I'll just say that, it was interesting if you look at the top two and bottom two box scores on this, when we assessed this in 2018, and this very much reflected our first assessment in 2015, it was really about using new technologies to derive more value from the data and to be that enhance the quality and compliance of data capture. So if you think about what ePro has done relative to paper scales and how you can improve and get a better read on patient compliance, it was much more along those elements. What I wonder is when we look at this again and we see mitigating risk as one of the bottom two box scores down at 61%, while still high, a relatively lower scoring attribute, you have to kind of consider that now with externalities like COVID-19 introducing risks that perhaps we didn't have high up on our risk register, whether some of the new and emerging technologies that enable more remote delivery of trials, whether those will become an element that has a greater prominence in terms of mitigating risk just by the flexibility in which they provide to how we execute trials. So I'll just jump in with that point, Patty, and I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. And if anybody actually wants this research, we're happy to send it to you. Just send us a little note in the chat box. Just sort of coming back to our conversation and the the takeaways from our roundtable, I think sort of the punchline, I guess, of a full day meeting was really like the failure to leverage new approaches and kind of innovate around how we're approaching qualification is going to result in missed opportunities. And the areas that we talked about really were around alignment on common standards. I think when I maybe first started in the industry, or even a few years ago, some of these things were considered competitive. And I think the industry has evolved over the years in terms of looking at what truly is competitive versus pre-competitive. So I think that there is sort of a new mindset around the use of standards. And I know there was also a lot of discussion at our meeting around how standards will not only help the sponsors, obviously, in terms of efficiency and cost savings, but it just provides greater transparency for providers, and particularly some of the newer companies that are coming into the clinical research space. We also talked about centralization, and again, just the fact that there is so much activity with every single company. It's a real opportunity to consolidate and centralize, some of these redundant activities into a single platform. So Brian, you and I had kind of had a long conversation about some of these things before the meeting when we met last summer, and just your thoughts about, standards. And can you share some of, your perspective on that, and also on centralization?
Yeah, absolutely. So, having evaluated service providers for many years, even with different organizations and in different functions within those organizations, there are certain basic standards that, I think all of us evaluate providers against. And of course, those basic standards vary by service line, but nevertheless, there's a certain baseline that we all repetitively go back, as you shared in the data earlier, Patty, that we continually go back and ask the same questions over and over. And again, back to efficiency, not only within sponsor companies, but also within the suppliers, trying to drive efficiency and focus our very precious resources on the most valuable activities. And what I'm not suggesting is that, all standards by which we evaluate service providers are the same. Every company will work with a provider differently or may have certain nuances to those standards. And that, I think, is oftentimes what gets confused with, just the basic centralized evaluation that we've alluded to and will continue to discuss. So from my perspective, I think, quite frankly, it's the opportunity for some early movers to align on those standards, demonstrate the value proposition, and then I think you'll really get the momentum necessary for this to take hold more broadly in healthcare.
Right. Yeah. I think that there's been a kind of a mentality of kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, for companies that feel like they have their own approaches, their own criteria. It's true that there's, a good portion of the qualification criteria that really apply across the board. And, we did talk about creating this sort of idea of a minimum criteria.
Patty, this
Yes.
is Lisa. I'd just like to jump in with a question. There's one question that was brought up actually by Marta Fields, and she was talking about smaller organizations and the bandwidth challenges for the provider visits and so forth, as being, particularly something in particular that we might talk about. So there's that. And also, one of the other questions, and maybe you can jump in now and talk about this, is the question of how we created the standards that we have.
Right, thank you. Well, so let's talk about the bandwidth challenges, because absolutely, for small to mid-sized companies, they have to apply the same type of rigor, but with, of course, fewer resources. And, we see that, when we pulled our advisory board together, for example, we had a nice mix of big pharma, small, medium-sized pharma, providers. And, I think it was interesting because in some of those workshops and discussions, some of the big companies, they had, 20, 30, 40 people that were assigned to be doing these qualification assessments. And, as Brian alluded to, maybe that isn't the highest value activity for some of these people, just in terms of the you know, the sheer level of, you know, reviews and back and forth and, you know, on-site visits. But for the smaller companies, it is really difficult, and it is, you know, I think it does make a case for, you know, driving these standards and moving to centralization. And as far as how these standards were created, you know, it certainly was not our subject matter experts at Avoca that came up with these standards. We tapped into our very large and diverse membership with the quality consortium. So, you know, 70 plus companies that we were collaborating with. And I have to say that, you know, there was power in that collaboration, because we received examples and actual criteria, you know, across the board from all of these members, which enabled our subject matter experts quickly to sort of assess and analyze and pull together a very robust set of standards. We also reached out to the providers themselves and companies that even weren't part of our membership, so that we would get a sort of a multi-stakeholder view. And we have a team that keeps them up to date. So, you know, as I said earlier, we're in a dynamic industry. So as regulations change, our standards evolve as well. And I know Dennis later will talk you know, a little bit more, you know, to give you some examples of what those standards include. And so before I turn it over to Jay, you know, just in terms of opportunities, you know, we have developed the Diligent Qualification platform, which also includes services. So it is a platform as a service offering, and it is really to, you know, drive efficiency, as we talked about, but it's also to help companies mitigate risk and ensure compliance, given that it's built on this rigorous set of standards. We also have an eye to the future in terms of really wanting to enable and support the industry in bringing in new types of technology and innovation, and provide that sort of central support and sort of harness our subject matter expertise to help our clients to really, as I said earlier, to get their arms around how to evaluate some of these emerging companies. And, you know, Brian, just to close things out, you know, we've worked with BMS for so many years, and kind of a fun fact that I don't know if you knew, BMS was one of Avoca's very first clients in 1999, so we go way back. But we had just more recently, we've just started having some discussions about Diligent. And, you know, I just wonder, like, what are your thoughts about the utility of Diligent, just in the context of the BMS organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can say I learned something new today. I was not aware that organizations have partnered for that duration. But for the audience, you know, as I had mentioned, we're developing our third-party risk management kind of next generation program. In the context of the integration, we're also re-looking at, you know, sourcing strategies, driving efficiency. Do we have the right partners? That manifests itself into, you know, evaluations. And BMS is in discussions with Avoca to seek to better understand the Diligent platform and determine whether or not, you know, it will serve as a means to improve our supplier qualifications. Because, again, I think, you know, the question around small companies or smaller companies not having a plethora of resources to do these evaluations, I absolutely appreciate it. Obviously, the big companies, you know, I've seen evaluation teams where we can have 30, 40 people on that, which, you know, there are many things to unpack there, which I won't touch on. But also, as far as the suppliers, and I know that we have suppliers on this call, and having been part of one for the first half of my career, we shouldn't lose sight of the burden that sponsors are putting on our suppliers, and to prepare for these evaluations, certainly the bigger ones. So the more that we can tap into a standardized, centralized platform such that we're not creating rework and precipitating value leakage, I think the better we'll all be.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Brian. And I want to just invite everybody, if I am going to turn the meeting over to Jay Turpin, but I'd like to invite everybody to just continue asking questions if you have further questions for Brian. And Brian, feel free to continue to jump in here as we go through the rest of our agenda. And Jay, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing your review of the Tufts Avoca benchmarking study.
Yeah, thanks, Patty. I think I'd just like to start by saying a big thank you to the Tufts organization. We've got Michael Wilkinson on the call today. It was Avoca's privilege to work with Michael Wilkinson and Professor Ken Getz in the development of this study, along with a group of companies that helped us tailor the benchmarking study and then ultimately gathering that data and taking a look at it. It's our understanding that there really was no industry-wide view of the vendor qualification process before running the study. And so really this is a beginning peek into how the pharmaceutical industry in clinical development are managing their vendor qualification processes and how they're ultimately starting their journey on risk management, starting with this vendor qualification. So some of the key takeaways that we saw as we went through this study was that for those that participated in our study, there were 17,000 new provider qualifications that were performed in 2018. And that's a lot. I think Patty showed the diagram earlier of 2,000 sponsors trying to qualify 4,000 plus clinical providers. It's a significant amount of effort both on the sponsor side and the vendor side to host those qualification processes, to run through the processes. We also asked some questions about how that volume is changing over time. We looked at 2016, 2018, and then we did a forecast into 2020. And as we looked at that data, it really showed that the compound annual growth rate was about 13%. And obviously it varied from type of company, but the small companies had the largest growth in terms of how many RFIs and vendor qualification assessments were taking place. We also looked at how they're getting done, and we saw about a third of the time companies were doing it with in-person visits where they're physically at the site of the vendor going through questions and answers. And 2/3 of the time, companies did a combination of both that in-person assessment as well as remote approaches. And I think Brian mentioned that earlier in the call, in this webinar, that there were questionnaires that go out, there's exchange of emails, et cetera, that take place. So the combination is happening 2/3 of the time. Just to give you the top line outputs that we saw out of the study, when you look at new provider qualifications, we gathered the data from those participating, and then we looked at the industry itself, and we believe there's about $130 to $150 million a year spent on new provider qualifications. That's a significant amount of money that is being utilized to do qualifications. And if you even add to that the RFIs and the requalification activities, very quickly those numbers go up to over $350 million spent annually on the qualification and requalification processes. And as Patty mentioned earlier, most of the sponsors are asking somewhat similar questions, but not exactly the same questions. And it's being done over and over with each sponsor reaching out to all their vendors. And from a vendor perspective, it may feel like a lot of duplication. We also looked at the cycle time vendor qualification, and we identified the fact that the time from the beginning where an organization would say, yes, we want to evaluate this company, starting with a request for information, an RFI, and assuming that went positive, to go through a vendor qualification process and then ultimately getting to a contract. We saw that it takes about 17 weeks for a company to get to that contract if the vendor that they're proposing to work with is kind of a single service vendor. And also with a multi-service vendor, much like a full service CRO, which may bring to the table many different kinds of services, that on average is taking about 23 weeks. So that's a pretty significant cycle time from the point of identifying a need for a particular vendor service to the point where you can actually start working with that vendor. Quite significant cycle times. And it raises the question, does that hinder drug development? And we asked some questions about delays due to this qualification process. And what we heard was about 7% of the time sponsors reported that programs were delayed because of vendor qualification, and CROs reported that it was about 14% of the time. And I think everybody in the industry is very sensitive to the fact that cycle time is crucial in getting programs rolling, and the cost of not delivering a new product to market each day, you lose value in that asset, and given the patent life, every day counts. And so that's a pretty significant cycle time, and we really learned a lot about that in this survey. And I think it informs us that we need to seek out better ways to deliver qualification in a more effective and efficient way, in a way that shortens cycle times. We also asked some questions about resources, and as you can see, the average pharma is 9 FTEs. They're dedicated to the process of qualification, and obviously that's dependent on the size of the organization, and large pharma definitely had the largest FTE application to the vendor qualification process. This is just a slide that speaks to the demographics of those that participated in the benchmarking study. We had 120 unique companies that participated in the study, and you can begin to see how many were pharmaceutical biotech, and as well how many were sponsors versus CROs versus other. And very quickly, we believe we had a very robust and diverse group of participants in the benchmarking study, which gives us a lot of confidence in the data results that we've been looking at. We also asked some questions about areas that were utilized in doing the vendor qualification assessment process within each company. And as we've mentioned, each company takes a slightly different approach. This is the top 50% of categories. Obviously, data privacy is at the top of the list, as well as quality management system review. Those are probably the ones that are most universally reviewed by all of the participating companies. But you can see as you go down that list, less and less of the companies are actually checking those areas during their vendor qualification process. And then the back half, the lower 50%, you can also see other categories of participation by the companies in terms of what they're asking during the qualification process. And as Brian mentioned in the beginning, really, if you think about vendor qualification, it's your first initial look at risks associated with a vendor, and it should be very helpful in informing how you approach risk management with that vendor. And it's always great to go in eyes wide open, understanding where the company's strengths are and where their weaknesses are. And as you can see, there's great diversity in terms of how companies approach the vendor qualification process. Sorry. We also asked questions about requalification, and as you can see, about 80–85% of the companies actually do requalifications, and the period by which they do that is in the range of 2 to 3 years. So different companies take different approaches on the requirements around requalifications. But again, that adds additional burden to the organization to requalify a vendor every 2 or 3 years. And many of the companies that said, no, we don't do requalifications, actually told us that they don't call it requalification. They establish an audit schedule with a vendor, and they do periodic audits. So there is an effort that goes on even with some of these companies that said no. This particular slide speaks to how many FTEs are involved in the VQA process. Again, you can see that large companies have the largest amount of resource application, and that is very frequently due to the fact that there are many different functions within the larger organizations with a more, I'll call it, siloed approach, with different specialties coming to the table to assess a vendor. And obviously, as you move down through the sizes of the organization, there's less resources that are dedicated to that process. And I think we heard the question earlier about, small companies don't have the bandwidth that the larger companies have. And you can see here from the data we collected that appeared to be the case across the small companies that were part of our benchmarking study.
Hey, Jay, can I just jump in here for a second? Because a question came in from one of the participants asking about the number of qualification assessments. And the question is, in 1/3 of cases, vendor qualification assessments happen in person according to the study. In which cases does it happen in person? And was there agreement from study participants on that?
It was not consistently done across the organization. So some companies insisted to always do it in person, and other companies took risk-based approaches where only in-person qualification visits happened when they perceived a higher risk profile for a vendor. So the short answer is there was a lot of diversity in terms of people's rationale, in terms of why they decided to either go in person only or in person versus virtual. I would say that everyone is trying to use good judgment, and as the numbers have gone up, I think we're seeing more and more of the virtual approach to do as much of the qualification process from a distance, rather than having to make a physical visit to the vendor. But across the board, everyone felt like there needed to be some assessment of the site, physical security, getting eyes on the facility and the processes and the people, and making sure that the work that they're being contracted to do is done in a way that the risks associated with working with that vendor are manageable.
Great. And then there was a follow-up question around whether now we're seeing that participants are making changes to their vendor qualification process following our study, and a question for us around are we planning any actions following the study, expanding our diligent offering, the number of suppliers on the platform? I'll take that last one. I mean, now, yes, we have clients that are working on with us on the platform, and as more sponsor companies come in and are onboarding their providers, the number of suppliers on the platform is increasing. And then as far as making changes to their vendor qualification process, I think that companies are just in various stages of assessing how to make changes. And some of it is, based on what Brian mentioned earlier in terms of taking more of a risk-based approach. And then the companies that we're working with are changing workflows, obviously, to shift to a more centralized model.
Yeah, absolutely, Patty. And let me just back up a couple slides. I quickly skipped over this, but again, as we have gone through this benchmarking study, we have seen different organizations take different approaches. And in fact, different functions kind of own the risks associated with certain deliverables. And as the companies get larger, there are more and more people involved in the risk management process and the qualification process. But across the board, everyone is trying to implement risk-based approaches to make sure that they're doing things in a smart way and they're addressing the risks that matter. And they can begin the process of risk management for a vendor based on what they learn out of the vendor qualification process. The last thing I wanted to touch on is just the cost. There are significant costs associated with qualification, and we gathered some cost data during this study. And what you can see, this is just a subgrouping of the costs that smaller companies spend on RFIs versus new vendor qualifications versus requalifications. And the bottom line is there's a pretty significant investment, and this is a per vendor cost. So when you bring on a new vendor, these are the kinds of costs that you would expect to have to apply to getting that vendor qualified and keeping them qualified as you move forward. So not trivial, and when you begin to then multiply those unit costs across every new vendor that you bring on board, it very quickly adds up to some significant numbers that are meaningful in an organization. Later in the presentation, John Jordan's going to speak to you a little bit about our diligent offering and how these costs then translate into opportunity with our diligent offering. And we've tried to take some of the data right out of this assessment, this benchmarking assessment, and apply it to our diligent offering and see what kind of cost savings, cycle time savings, et cetera, that you can begin to see with the diligent platform and our services that we provide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dennis.
Thanks, Jay. And as I flip over to grab presentation mode, Lisa, maybe you could roll us right into the first polling question. And this way we can jump right in so we can make up a little bit of time. So do we have polling showing, Lisa? There we go. Okay, so this polling question, when it comes to provider qualification, the issue that my company struggles with most is, and there's 4 selections. I'll give a little bit of detail around each one of them. So time, delays, and bottlenecks. These are time delays for getting the providers on board because of bottlenecks in the process itself. So working through and across those different verticals that Jay had just showed us, delays associated with that, inefficiency, so lack of efficiency in the process itself. So a measure of kind of how speed or expeditiously we can get through the process. The resource burden, meaning the number of resources we apply to satisfy our internal processes. So think about that in terms perhaps of FTEs. And then finally, silos. So again, thinking back to that diagram that Jay showed across different functions and the responsibilities and accountabilities of those functions, just any silos, any information silos or communication breakdowns between those functions that would inhibit the flow and efficient exchange of information. Sort of a measure of the liquidity between those functions. Okay. So I don't think I'm able to see. Lisa, can you jump in and tell me how far we are along in gathering responses for the poll?
Yes, we are at about 65%. I think we should probably close it in a few seconds.
All right. So let's go ahead. Yeah, move that forward. So as you can see here, the resource burden stands out as sort of our top challenge. So just the amount, I think this goes back to one of the questions I saw earlier around smaller organizations feeling this acutely, and that we just don't have the resources to cover the portfolio of providers we need to cover. And I can share that just from discussions across multiple different size organizations, while it's felt acutely by smaller organizations, large organizations with larger portfolios of assets and a more diverse provider base often also struggle with this challenge. The second box there, or the second highest rated box, the time delay and bottleneck. So just how quickly can we bring these capabilities on board, bring these providers on board? I know, speaking from past experience as a provider and a sponsor, that on both sides that can be a challenge. So I think, we see there some of the strain that's been vocalized here that aligns well to what we observed in terms of the metrics captured in the top study. So why don't we roll to, we'll roll to the next slide, and I believe that opens up actually another polling question. And I wanted to dig deeper a little bit into the silos question. So we saw silos as sort of a lower scoring item on this first poll. Wanted to dig deeper into that and the relationship specifically with efficiency, since the resources and the time seems to be a challenge. Is there something around the efficiency that's due to how we work across functions? And I can now see the polls are rolling in, so we'll give you guys, another minute or so to put that in, and then we'll move along. Okay, it looks like we're at about 2/3. We'll give maybe 10 more seconds. Okay, and I think we'll show those results now. Thank you, Lisa. So it looks like at about, half agree. So we're seeing about half agree that there is some element of functional silos that perhaps is contributing towards some of the efficiency loss that we saw in some of the data, and then about a third that are indifferent or maybe don't have visibility into that. So interesting that there may be something around the functional silos, and there may be something along the lines of how we share information across functions or even vertically within the different functions. So why don't we'll move along to the next slide. So I'm going to move us ahead just in the interest of time through that slide, because I think Jay covered that really well. And Lisa, if you could open up what'll be our second to last polling question that really looks sort of externally. So our initial polls were more around internal challenges. Now if we think externally, ICHE 6R2 and the changes with that addendum to the guidance and how that's maybe prompted your organization to think differently or perhaps act differently in terms of the rigor and the documentation that you're now capturing as you're working through that qualification process and documenting that in such a way that you can recreate that on inspection, where you have to create that story that's potentially years and years away from when you originally made the decisions around a particular vendor or category of vendors. So I see we're just about approaching the halfway mark, so we'll give another minute around that, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation around that before moving into our last polling question. All right, so I'm seeing us close in on about 2/3 of the vote. We'll give you 5 more seconds, and then Lisa, I think you could open it up to show the audience. Okay, so we see roughly, just shy of half agree that there has been some movement since R2 has been implemented, and that there are changes in terms of the process and documentation. While we have 24% strongly agree. So if you aggregate those up together, looking at about 70% that have made that change. 10% that perhaps were proactive and had already, perhaps addressed proactively some of the changes in the addendum around third-party qualification, and about 20% that just didn't share an opinion. So I think what this shows is that in addition to considerations around our own internal processes and the things that are within our control in terms of how efficient we are and how we share information, how we work cross-functionally, be it a large or a small organization, there are also things we need to consider outside of our walls. So just keeping pace with regulations, with guidance, and with a shifting and perhaps increasing level of rigor and expectation and requirement from regulatory bodies that will come to inspect and look at the vendor qualification, the evidence of vendor qualification that we have, and as much as the clinical data and evidence that we have supporting our dossiers.
Hey,
so
Ben,
why don't we move? Oh, go ahead, Patty.
Yeah, Ben from the audience has a question here that I thought maybe we could bring in. He says, do any companies actually do effective evaluations of their qualification programs? And I think the way I'm understanding that is, are there companies out there that are actually doing a really good job with qualification and aren't kind of dealing with some of the challenges and struggles? And Ben, let me know if that is not a good interpretation of your question. But I just want to weigh in and say, you know, of course, like we're, you know, what we see is an incredible amount of intentionality and rigor and, you know, concern around how companies are qualifying their vendors. You know, what we're talking about is sort of just common industry issues and challenges, because the whole approach actually needs a rehaul. You know, like I just feel like our industry is an industry that is very slow to move and slow to change. And so we're bogged down by some of the bureaucracy around it, and sometimes an overinterpretation of regulations. But it's not to say that companies are not applying rigor or, you know, doing the right thing when it comes to qualifying their providers. And Ben, let me know if that wasn't the question. And Dennis, anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to something that Brian had aptly pointed out about, you know, how he's taking his vision forward with BMS. So Brian described their approach to third parties as next gen, right? Next generation. And I think that's a very forward-looking and progressive way to consider how an organization is approaching qualification, because there's a bit of a ceteris paribus, you know, challenge here, right? So if all things stayed the same, I think that many companies, from what we've seen, while there's diversity in approach, and that came through in a lot of the Tufts data, had things not changed, were things static in our industry, that would be okay. But what I think what we're learning acutely now with COVID-19, but is represented in other domains, such as the changes to regulatory guidance and shifts in the types of capabilities that are out there and the movement towards more digital technologies. I think what we're seeing is the world around us is changing. So while our organizations may be doing a good job today, it's thinking through that next gen lens of how are we going to do the same or better job tomorrow with perhaps a different type of provider base, a different paradigm in terms of how we execute clinical trials, a different expectation around what our levels of oversight need to look like and be documented to in terms of how we demonstrate that. So I think that's the lens I'd like everybody to take away from this. It isn't so much that we're not doing a good job today, but in terms of how are we making sure that we're going to do a good and even better job moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Janice. That's well put.
So let's roll forward one more poll, and then I think we're going to get into a little bit more of a conversation on some potential solutions on how we could do that, and you know, our interpretation of how that could happen through diligent. But Lisa, if you could roll question 3. This polling question 3 really focuses on kind of an entree point to how we can do a better job. So thinking about your organization today and the use of standards for qualification, and we'll talk a little bit about how Avoca, through the Avoca Quality Consortium and through Diligent, has developed and then operationalized standards as a mean to bring about some of the efficiencies that we think lay the bricks for the road to tomorrow in terms of how we do a good and better job moving forward. So we're approaching the halfway point. We'll give about 15 more seconds, and right on the minute mark, we'll close the poll and take a look at the data.
And Dennis, while we're waiting for the poll to close, there were a bunch of questions around whether we're going to share the slides. The answer is yes, and we'll also actually share the results of these polling questions as well.
Great. All right, Lisa, let's close that out and let's take a look. So looking at the level of agreement, we're about 3/4, about 76% either agree or strongly agree. Their organization is open to the use of standards. So using something, you know, industry-wide industry standards to base their qualification assessments on, with 22%, you know, sort of indifferent to it. And I think, you know, the takeaway here is a very small percent, you know, at all that strongly disagree with that. So I think what I'm taking away is a very openness to looking to what is the industry standard, what is good look like, or what does acceptable look like when we're qualifying vendors across the board, or perhaps in a specific domain or capability or category.
And, you know, part of the purpose of this meeting for us too is to really learn from the participants and to get some feedback. And if the person or the people that strongly disagree could just write a comment around their thoughts around that. I think that would help us to just understand perspectives. And then, before you segue into the next topic, Dennis, I just wanted to also say that we also want to get some feedback on this idea of centralization and our Diligent platform. And that's part of the reason that we're, we were asked to sort of give a little more color around Diligent, since it's new and the concept of centralization is new. So please also let us know if there are any almost like allergic reactions, let's put it that way, to the idea of centralization as we get through the remainder of the meeting.
Thanks, Patty. So Lisa, I think we can hide those results and we'll flip back to the slides. And just to give a view, if you remember back to when we opened the session, Patty had flashed up our member logos. If you're a member company, what I'm about to show and describe are standards that are available today. So as we talk through standards, these are standards that were put together by the Avoca Quality Consortium for its members as a deliverable. What's showing on the screen now are what we consider the core standards. These are the standards that are germane to all providers. So whether you're providing eCOA services, wearables, medical imaging, data management, whether you're an FSP or an endpoint generating function, these are the things that we would assess. So we look at things such as the organization as a whole, its sustainability. We look at the quality management system overall and how third parties are managed, as well as training, SOPs, human resource management, those sorts of things that apply to all organizations. We also have a set, and that's on the left side, or at least on my left side, of technical standards. And I'll get into an example of these. I won't get too detailed, but these are the different domains that we cover today in the consortium with standards available, as well as in Diligent through the RFIs and other services that are available. So these are different functions or endpoint generating services, if you will. Some of which are the ones that we're familiar with from a long and mature time scale in clinical trials, like cardiac monitoring and ECGs or central lab services. And some of them represent what we're very rapidly moving into now with telemedicine and wearables, electronic informed consent, and the like. To speak about how these were developed, though, before we move on, is that, as Patty mentioned, these weren't standards that Avoca put forth independently. These were standards that were developed by first asking our membership to contribute their information. So what are their expectations? What are their RFIs? What are the standards by which they qualify providers through? And then going through a thorough research process to combine that and synthesize that with appropriate regulations, regulatory guidance, expert papers, or other pieces of information within the industry that would guide either define where those expectations come from or guide further requirements. Now, in some cases, we couldn't demonstrate that traceability back to a finite reference to a guidance or a regulation, where it was just something that was an industry expectation, as it were. And in those cases, we would define it as such. And the purpose for being that there was transparency between sponsors and providers to understand the why behind some of the questions. So why is something important? Where is the basis, in this requirement? And why does that standard need to be met? And by bringing that sort of transparency to bear, it gives everyone something to fall back on in terms of reference material to look back at to ensure that requirement is met and understand it better based on what's described in the guidance or in the context of a regulation. So I'll move us ahead. So just to kind of bring some color into what a technical standard could look like. And these are some of the materials that we developed in 2019, and we've got more coming out in 2020. But looking at something like electronic regulatory binders or the electronic site files, right? Something that's probably very much on the top of minds in terms of doing some remote monitoring today in the wake of COVID-19. Beyond what we have in the core requirements, we also push through to assess things like alerts and reporting, the level of integration and connectivity the system would have, how they manage access control and electronic signatures. So as you can see, some of these do cross in, particularly electronic signatures may cross into a 21 Part 11 compliant or a systems validation requirement that's present in our core standards, but we put these in context of the technical category that's being assessed. And we do that across all of our different categories of service. So you can see as I flip through some of these that there are obviously the subcategories, that these standards fall under change a little bit. And just to give a visual on what a standard looks like, when you get into a standard, we have these all, again, traceable down to the regulation or guidances that apply to these. So for instance, in this, again, example of the E-reg binders, when we're thinking about document management, and specifically within that task management, you can see that there's a TMF guidance from EMA, as well as Part 11 and other ICH applicable references that are there, so that there's a holistic view in terms of what the genesis or the origination point of this standard or requirement is. And then obviously when we move into requesting information about how well a provider meets these standards translate into the RFI question or questions, and then would further translate into what would be looked at in an on-site or remote assessment, as it were, pertinent to whatever service we were assessing. So those are materials that are available through the Avoca Quality Consortium, and that became foundational for the Diligent platform. As we move into speak a few minutes about Diligent and about how we've operationalized these, I want everyone to kind of consider that those standards are maintained by the Quality Consortium as sort of an independent body to really do the research and keep pace with changes in regulation, changes in practice around those standards. As we move in to discuss the Diligent platform and services, it's more about actioning off of those standards. So taking that foundational information and translating it into action. And we do that in 3 different domains. So we do that primarily, the first point would be the platform itself, the technology. And I saw a question around cloud, what does cloud-based mean? That has to do with the architecture, and it basically means it doesn't live on a server somewhere. It's a shared resource. It's a platform that's distributed across multiple resources. That's something we can follow up offline with much more detailed information on. But the point of it is this is a web-accessible, centralized piece of technology where information can be exchanged, whether that's to search on different parameters to find a provider, or review RFI information, or compare RFIs across multiple providers. It also facilitates some work through, and John's going to take us through some examples of this, of where when you want to take it further to actually assess a provider, there's a way to go ahead and do that in some novel ways. That leads us into the idea that there's some services around this. So in addition to just being the technology, moving information in a more liquid format between parties, there's the opportunity to request and to potentially have a shared platform for conducting vendor qualification assessments. Now, this isn't a platform where we bring together Merck or Pfizer or BMS or other sponsors where one would do the assessment and others would kind of benefit from that or participate in that. This is a platform where through Diligent, there's an independent third party conducting the assessment, and then that information can be shared by multiple sponsors without actually the sponsors knowing who else is participating in that assessment activity. So the analogy is a little bit around Groupon, if you will, and that multiple people can kind of participate in a common event of interest. And all those activities are facilitated by the deliverables, by the standards and tools that came out of the consortium in terms of the standards or the criteria, the questionnaires, and then some of the other deliverables like scorecards and visit checklists that facilitate the evaluation and the on-site or remote assessment of a provider to examine the evidence of what they provided as responses in the RFI. So with that, let me hand it over to John Jordan. John, if you could take it from here, you can speak a little bit more perhaps about the platform and maybe lead us through an exercise and what it can do.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Dennis. So what you see here, folks, this is pretty much the takeaway we want, with the traditional process on top, which most companies follow today, where they manually search for the providers. That takes about 30 days to develop the RFI, come up with that provider list, and send them out. Once you send them out, the provider has a few weeks to complete them. Then they send the RFI back. You can do your analysis. once you analyze that a certain number of the providers you received the RFIs from are worthy of qualification, they're going to be able to do the services that you're expecting on this particular trial or program, then you can go to the qualification. So you're looking at somewhere in a 6 to 8 to 12 week process just to get the vendor qualified in the traditional method. Utilizing the Diligent platform, obviously we cut that down to a fraction. They can search within Diligent, find the providers they are interested in, request the RFIs directly through the platform from the providers. The providers are then notified via the platform that a request has been sent. They are directed to take action in that notification, and then they can either release the RFI to you immediately, and we've seen it happen within hours, but we typically wait 3 days. We give 72 hours to the provider for them to respond to your request. But even with that, we're obviously cutting down months into days. That allows you to do your analysis of the RFIs much quicker, much sooner in the process of the startup, and then start your qualification efforts, much sooner down the pipeline. Additionally, as Dennis mentioned, we can then have the users request a qualification assessment through the platform, and then have the Diligent team perform and conduct that qualification assessment. And in that light, we then notify the other sponsors on the platform that this qualification is taking place, and it allows them to join in, as Dennis mentioned, with the Groupon mentality, where they can join in and see cost savings on sharing that expense. So the real bang for your buck there, though, is on the provider side. As we spoke about earlier, with the providers, they'll have sponsor A coming in this week, sponsor B coming in next week, and sponsor C coming in next month. They will potentially be sharing 90 to 95% of the exact same content. So that repetition and redundancy is what we're aiming to address here. Next slide, Dennis. Dennis? Oh, thank you. So what you see here, folks, is the dashboard for the sponsor portal. When you sign into the platform, you have multiple actions available to you. Typically, it's finding the providers or requesting RFIs. When you request an RFI, as I said, that's notification is sent directly to the provider, and they will take action on that. And then you can also request the assessments to be conducted in here as well. When the assessments are available for multi-sponsor assessments, that notification will go out on the platform to all of the other sponsor users, informing them. And as Dennis said, we won't tell them who the originating sponsor was, but we'll inform them that we are performing or conducting a qualification assessment of this particular provider on these dates. And if you're interested in joining in, they have the capabilities of just clicking a button within the platform to join into that qualification. Next slide, Dennis. Thank you. And right here, what we show, this is the shared assessments calendar. This is available to participating sponsors, where they would have access to this calendar, where they would be able to see any upcoming qualification assessments or audits that we have scheduled within the platform. And then they will also have the ability to just click on an assessment on the calendar and join into that assessment right there through the platform as well. Next slide. So what we have here, folks, is the return on investment calculator that we've developed for the Diligent platform. I've done this in prior lives for EDC and ePro, eDiary. What we really try to do here is show the hidden costs that aren't really captured by sponsor organizations. So when a study team is getting ready to conduct a qualification, they have to go through a certain process of preparing, conducting the qualification, and reviewing. So all of that spend is usually charged to the study budget, and it's not broken down into the qualification effort. So that's a hidden cost that sponsors never really see. So with this case study that we have up here, we took the Tufts and Avoca working group benchmarks that we gathered from our effort last year, and we put in right here for the average pharma sponsor would have somewhere around 28 RFIs, 26 provider qualifications, and 5 qualification audits, and then 2 study-specific audits. So with this breakdown here and utilizing 20% of the co-sponsored, the multi-sponsor assessments, that would allow, and go ahead and advance one, there you go, Dennis. That would allow for up to 40% savings, a little more than 40% savings on their overall spend. So that was on an average farm. And if you go to the next slide, Dennis, we took a large farmer's numbers out of the Tufts data. And you can see here with the volume of 100 RFIs and 60, 80, 82 qualification visits, again, using multi-sponsor for 20% of the qualifications, you're then seeing close to 50% savings for a large farm on that. So it's reducing the hidden costs and the hidden spend within the sponsor organizations. And what we like to do, and we're certainly open to this, we'd like to invite anyone who would like to work with us to plug in your specific information, your volume, your costs. We are able to work with you to develop a very, very specialized, very tailored ROI report for you with your data and your numbers in there. So with that, I know we're running short on time, so I went pretty quick there, but.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
I'll hand it back to Patty, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Patty.
We had actually one question that I wonder if Brian is still in the meeting. If he could weigh in on. Brian, are you there?
I'm still here.
Okay. It's actually not an easy question, but the question is, are there any ideas or recommendations for quick wins for improving the vendor qualification process and to address some of these inefficiencies and address some of the silos? Because I think, my take on this question is that, everybody and every company is trying to do the best they can, given the situation. And I think the situation is getting more and more intense now with what we're dealing with COVID-19. So it's really a question for all the panel members on what are some ideas? But Brian, do you have any thoughts on it?
So this is within an individual company or as an industry?
I think so. Christiane, if you want to, add some color to your question, feel free to do that. But I think it's really within an individual company. Any shortcuts or quick hits that you could recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I promise everyone on this call I was not paid to say this or compensated in any way, but quite frankly, as I had mentioned before, we're in active discussions with the Avoca group around assessing the Diligent platform. I think that is one opportunity amongst many. And our point of view is for us to try to standardize and build those standards amongst peer groups. But it will take some time. I mean, let's be clear, this does not happen overnight. But we're looking at partners like the Avoca group who already have a database of information, one that we can tap into and potentially build upon. We're hoping to extract value out of that right out of the gate.
Thank you, Brian. And, Christiane, I'll also give some thought just in terms of individual companies and, how we might be able to support you. There are a lot of tools that we have available to our members that are part of the Quality Consortium. So we'll be in touch directly with you on that. And as we come to the close of the meeting, I just want to thank everybody for your participation. Thank you, Brian, for partnering with us on this, and also Jay, Dennis, John. And we will provide the slides, the polling question answers, and any questions. I think we got to most of the questions, but anything that we didn't get to, we will follow up with you on. And this conversation can continue on our online platform, AHA. You know, we are seeing that now that people are not able to convene in person at conferences, we are seeing a lot of interaction, which is really nice to see on our online community of support for each other. So thank you again. Stay well and be healthy.